welcome to Maverick Mindcast. My guest today is Ed Giron. Did I say that right, Ed?
Yeah.
Okay, good. We actually met through if you guys have heard of Rebel Capitalist, that world online. Obviously had a lot of mutual interest in finances and how it relates to the conspiratorial world. And Ed has since taught me a lot and had a lot to say about a lot of different aspects of finance and how it does relate to New World Order, global agendas, which I think is sorely missing in the influencer world of finance. I think anybody who cares about what's going on and wants to know more about how they can kind of stay afloat during everything that we're seeing going on around us should know about this stuff. So I invited Ed to come on, and I told him I want him to introduce himself because I think he has the best perspective on his background and can tell his story the best as to why he's here and why I wanted to have him on. Particularly, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, but I'm sure we'll go down other rabbit holes because that just always seems to be the way, right? It's no fun if you don't do that. So I'll stop talking, and Ed, I'll let you take over. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So first off, I'm super happy to be here on the Maverick Mindcast.
Thank you. We're super happy to have you.
Say that. I'm a normal guy who just started connecting some dots over the years. I never cared about money or anything. You know, it's my first part of my life. I was really into combat sports. So I was a wrestler, collegiate wrestler. Transition to mixed martial arts. That was my world. I didn't care about anything else. It was just, I want to compete, and that was pretty much my focus. So once I moved on to the next phase, it was just, where do we go from here, right? So I started working, in blue collar construction, doing things like that. And somewhere along the line, I kind of started noticing that I just felt like I wasn't getting ahead, and it was just, you're wondering what you're working so hard over, and you're doing things, you're doing everything right, but then you just feel like you're not getting ahead. You feel like you're on a hamster wheel. So it's started going down some rabbit holes, and just my world started just kind of, everything I thought I knew just goes out the window. So it's I don't know if you felt the same way. You had your old world, and then you start to
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a kind of like being reborn, I think, when you discover that there's a whole different set of truths out there that don't necessarily align with the, truths that we're indoctrinated to believe and to live our lives by. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
then somehow that got you into finance.
So
or was this before or after?
So I was working in, blue collar work. So I was, my father owns a, construction painting company on Long Island. I was working for, the pretty much like the wealthy, high net worth clients here on like the North Shore. So anyone who's from Long Island knows the North Shore. That's where the higher net worth people live. So I was working, I was at the highest end of that spectrum of work, and it just wasn't fulfilling. I said, let me try something else. So an opportunity came along, and I had an opportunity to work in a financial services company. I didn't know I had no financial background, zero. I just kind of said, I'm going to try this white collar thing. And I got to the books, and I just started devouring information, self-taught, passed all these tests, got my financial advising licenses. And at first I really, the work was fulfilling because I really thought it was like, making a difference, like helping people set aside and get ready for retirement, the whole spiel that the industry tells you. But because I'm so competitive and I'm looking at the products I was selling, and I'm thinking like, I want to sell the best of the best stuff. The problem is when you work for brokerage, you're tied to the products that they sell. So you start to see like, maybe this isn't the best stuff, but because you're a broker, you're only allowed to sell certain types of things. And then around the same time, I discovered Robert Kiyosaki. I was watching Rich Dad Radio, and my two worlds started conflicting because on one end, you're taught people need to put money in a retirement account, stock money away in their 401k, save for a rainy day. And I started listening to Robert, and he started saying, you know, the complete opposite, because he knew the global macro picture that we're going to get into. But it's the more and more I learn.
Now, wait 1 second, just for people
Yep.
who may not know, can you just briefly define like macroeconomics?
So macroeconomics is basically when you bring everything that moves the financial system in the world. So that comes to could be real estate, could be equities, bonds, debt, you know, anything that has to do with the financial system around
So like the
commodity.
bigger picture,
Yeah, the bigger, just the way the world functions.
whole
Everything.
ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's macro. So commodities, precious metals, you know, shares in companies, equities, like I said, debt. Now they're, you know, Bitcoin, not cryptocurrency. We'll get into that, but
Yeah, I'm curious.
that's now part of macro. But yeah, so not, you know, I don't want to go too crazy on my life, but just basically I started seeing that the industry, you're selling things that you ultimately find out they're not really going to do the best for the client. The industry education makes you think that's the way things have always been. So you're just basically peddling what you've learned, like, oh, the market always goes up, and just put your money away and it's always returned this amount, and
Compound interest.
exactly. Oh, yeah, exactly. Compound interest. Don't worry about it. Just sock it away. We get our fee, and you retire. You know, you sail off into the sunset once you know, your retirement comes. And the more you dig into that background, you start to realize like it's just not true. And I'm going to uncover and go into like all these reasons, but I think that's the main reason I ended up having to leave the financial industry, because I knew it's just, you know, it's ideally not the best for, it worked the last 40 years. We'll get into why I don't think it's going to work going forward, but ultimately I didn't believe in what I was selling. So I left the industry and went back to, you know, working in blue collar to pay the bills. But now I've uncovered, I think, the mission of what I think is going to save humanity, to be honest, because what we're up against, it's like people don't understand. It's your audience might understand that there's absolute manipulation of how this planet works. People that know me that might be watching this at some point, you might have no idea what we're about to get into, but the main thing you need to know is that there is a force that controls just about every aspect on this planet. And the main thing that they control is the money, which is just energy. They control the energy, your monetary energy. They control everything through that mechanism. So I don't know if you want to say anything, and then I guess I'll keep going. But
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that's where my skepticism comes in with Bitcoin. But I will say, because I think we'll kind of go have a little debate here, probably just organically happen, because of that principle that there's this force that controls things. I find it hard to believe that they don't control Bitcoin. So I'm hoping that when you keep going and you don't have to do it right away, I always want to know the difference. I'm always confused about Bitcoin in the sense that they're like, oh, Bitcoin is, you know, it's at 50,000 now or whatever. I don't understand what that means versus, and like I said, this is jumping too far ahead. I'm just telling you, this is like what's on my mind versus, well, anybody can own Bitcoin. So I don't understand what that means. And that's just because I don't understand what that means, not because I think the system's flawed. I never understood. There's not a lot of tangible elements to Bitcoin, in my opinion, which bothers me.
And that's a key feature, and we'll get into that. And you know, that to start, there's a book here. It's called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. So this
Who's
book,
that by?
it actually, so what this is actually a representation of a document that was found at a government auction. For they were selling government printers, and someone uncovered a confidential document that was jammed. They bought, I guess, a bulk of printers for their business. And they're going through them, and they found the classified document People have come forward and say they wrote it, whatnot. So it's kind of, you have to have some sort of skepticism when you read this stuff, because there's too much, I guess, bifurcation for like who really wrote this and is behind this. But what this small book really talks about is the fact that high up people in the government fully know that economics is just an extension of a natural energy system. So the same way electrical systems work, the same way any type of energetic system work, you can apply those same principles to an economy. So you can add inputs to create outputs of, things that you may want to happen. So what they discovered is that if they are able to control the economic system the same way you would, develop an an engine, I guess you could call it, they discovered you can pretty much control every aspect of the planet. And this, I have this highlighted and tabbed, and like it goes into like real detail of like comparing energy and economics. And so what's the point? Point is, most of us spend our time on this planet, we're here to have an experience, but you realize most of the time you end up spending, it's work, just to get ahead. The problem is most people don't understand that the current monetary system, the global monetary, it goes beyond borders, US, that doesn't matter. This planet is on a central bank. It's run by central banks. The central banks understand these energetic systems. The main thing you need to know is that when a central bank takes hold of a country, they're given now the power to create currency. Now, why is that a problem? They create currency from thin air. They do it in the form of, printing. They could actually print physical money, or they can create digits on a screen. What you need to know is they have no restraints on the currency they create. And that means they can create booms, busts, they can engineer wars, they control every aspect of the planet through this mechanism, because they understand that everything is energy, and certain inputs into an economy are going to cause people to react in a certain way, which can cause shortages here, problems to pop up there. So that goes into the history of the United States. I don't know if you want any questions on that.
No, it makes sense to me.
Yes, I mean, like the first thing they do is when they want to get an outcome, they'll pour money into a system.
Yeah.
They pour credit. It is currency that does not exist, never has, it never will. It's just digits on a screen. They do that in the form of loans. So they offer loans to people, easy money at low rates. And typical, like our human nature is like easy money. We tend not to, allocate it, I guess, as best as possible for your business. You're going to take on debt, and you're not going to be as, I guess, stringent with your money if you got it easily. So what happens is they pour all this credit into the system. Businesses load up on debt. They get, over leverage, which means they're just taking on insurmountable amounts of debt. And what happens is they create a giant bubble, because you have people just being reckless with their money,
And also, we don't teach people about money.
Well, that's the key.
That's really amazing. No one goes to school and learns about these things.
Yeah, by design, for whatever reason. I mean, we know the reason, but they don't want economically educated, or they don't want people to understand the financial system. So banks are given the power to create money. They load, they throw out credit into the system, and then people load up on debt. Once you have everyone in an insane amount of debt, that's when they start slashing interest rates, pulling credit out of the system by not giving loans. So what does that do? People now have full order books. They have a ton of inventory. They hired more people because the demand signal was misguided. So because there's all this credit in the system, it just creates malinvestment, creates waste. And now at the opportune time when these people control the planet, they want to come in and swoop in and take over various, assets, they pull the credit out and they jack up interest rates and it causes a collapse or a depression, recession. And
Now,
that's
I
like
have
the,
one question though. I do. I'm sorry.
yeah,
I
yeah.
thought about what you were talking about. And so I know David talked about this, a few other people have talked about this, how it's just numbers on a screen. So like if I get a mortgage, they just type something in there and they say, okay, like $200,000 has been transferred to whomever, to get you this house. That's your loan.
Yeah.
But how then does that create wealth? You know what I mean? Like I believe you, but then I'm like, I understand, but then I'm like, wait a minute, if they're just numbers on a screen, which I know they are, how is that then like, okay, we'll take it now because it's up on the screen. So here, take this house. Like, how does that work? That part has always confused me a bit.
So the main key that people need to understand is that they need people to believe that money is tangible or that it should tangible. They need you to think as, paper notes, like when you hold a $100 bill in your hand or a credit card, like you think money is real. In reality, paper notes, it's like 2% of all the currency in the system. The key is when a bank makes a loan, they create, so for a simple example, you want a $50,000 loan to buy a house. Obviously that's nowhere near the price of a house today, but let's just say so they'll literally type in $50,000 and they'll credit it to your account, but you have to pay that $50,000 back with interest. Here's the key that no one understands. The interest is not created. So when they type in $50,000 into your account, you owe that $50,000 plus interest. Now you have to go into the real economy, whether it be through your job, your business, whatever it is you do to provide the marketplace value. You have to go find the $50,000, the principal, and the interest. This ensures that there's never enough currency in the system to pay back all the debt. It's a giant scam, and that's with every facet of finance. And Dr. Richard Werner, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's actually, I guess, the godfather of quantitative easing. He coined the term when Japan was going through their their equity market bubble. He wrote a paper and he actually did a case study that proves banks create money from see, like the thing is, like, people talk about it, but it's not really out there. He actually went and did a case study, went to a bank, went through all the the steps, and he basically proved he took out a $200,000 loan and they just conjured it up because it's a fractional reserve system. So what that means is banks can lend credit that they do not have in the vault. So most people think, like, when a bank lends money, oh, it's a pile of cash sitting in the vault, and you have to, oh, well, we have X amount there, so we're going to lend you this and charge a little bit of interest because we got to make something too. But that's total nonsense. Fractional reserve says banks can lend credit into existence that they do not hold. And
yeah, I think a good example, sorry to cut you off, is that basically, like, imagine if every person who had an account at a bank went the same day to the bank and said, I want to get my money out. There's no way they wouldn't be able to give it.
It doesn't exist. Like, people look at the checkings account, they see these digits. That money does not exist. Go try and take out even a couple of grand at a bank. They start questioning you like you're a criminal. The money doesn't exist. And that's the biggest scam. That's what people they think there's a semblance of tangibility to money, but this, whatever force you want to call it, that controls the monetary system, they know that money does not exist.
One other question.
Yeah, sure.
Now, do you still feel the same way about the financial system when we were on the gold standard, or was it more legitimized the gold standard?
So I'll get to that because that's a very important part. Yeah. So all right. So yeah, right. There's for your audience, fractional reserve basically means banks can lend you money that they don't have in the vault and charge interest on it. So they create digits on a screen, they lend them to your account, and you
enslave you to that debt.
You're a slave because you now owe the debt plus interest. The interest isn't created; it doesn't exist. So now everyone has various ways that they provide value to the marketplace. So you got to, if you have a business, your job, whatever it is, you have to go and get the money to pay back your principal and interest, but there's never enough currency in the system to pay all the debt back. So that's why everyone's on the hand. It could be different levels. You could be a multimillionaire on a hamster wheel. You could be someone who works for minimum wage on a hamster wheel. It's just a giant scam. So how did we get to this? So one of the things that the founding fathers of the United States knew is the danger of central banks, because this isn't anything new. Like this stuff has been going on for thousands, since ancient times. Like there's always been it's called usury if you look at like old religious texts. But
could you compare the feudal system to what this is?
Well, yeah, I mean it's
like serfdom.
Yeah, you have overlords, which are the banks, because they ultimately, if someone creates, let's say someone has control of everything that you have to work for, but they don't have to work to create it. And that's where gold comes in. It's like gold backed money, because it needed work to dig out of the ground and refine and mine, right? That's what gave money value. That's why
there's a perceptual value there too.
There's a perceptual value because it took work to make. That's the key. But if a bank just types into a screen digits into your account, what work did that take?
Inherent value. Sorry, isn't it more inherent? It's a perceptual
intrinsic. Gold has intrinsic value.
Intrinsic.
To an extent. But like that's the key difference. The founding fathers knew that money had to have something back it. That's why this country was founded on a hard money standard, backed by gold, silver. Gold and silver take physical energy to go out in the world, dig it up, find it, refine it, melt it down, create coins. It takes work. It takes a lot of work. So and it's scarce. It's not exactly easy to go and find gold. So, that's a certain, money has to have certain principles. It's got to be scarce, durable. Gold is durable. It's going to last thousands of years, has lasted thousands of years. Divisible. So you could, ultimately you can melt down a gold bar into coin. So it is divisible. Fungible, which means if you have an ounce of gold and I have an ounce of gold and we swap it, it's still an ounce of gold. So that's fungibility. So money has certain properties. That's how this country was founded. That's what stops, governments from being reckless, because they're constrained to the amount of work they've done to issue currency. So if you have a certain amount of gold, you can only issue a certain amount of currency backed by that gold. So let's say, just for simplicity, 1 ounce of gold, $1, right? That's how this country was founded. Now the problem came along, now this is after the American Revolution, which that's another rabbit hole, but most people think we started the American Revolution over small percentage of tax. The reality is the Bank of England, or England, the government of England at the time, they were in debt to the central bankers, the Rothschilds, and they were desperate to pay back, because again, it's central banks enslave countries, and it's the same today. England had
and that's the Federal Reserve for us.
Yeah. We'll get to that, because that's the big, that's the main point here. But just basically, England was basically enslaved to the central bankers of that time, and then they were desperate, so they started getting crazy, going after the colonists, and that's when all of the taxation, the tea, and everything to the colonists got to a point where we're like, F you, and then that brought upon the American Revolution. Fast forward, we beat England. Now you have the United States, or the colonies at that time. So at the time, these central bankers, they wanted to infiltrate that the new country. So they want to control everything. So they needed a way to now get their central banking system into the new country, the United States. America had the first central bank, which Thomas Jefferson actually fought really hard to prevent. So they were able, because again, the way the central bankers work is they have access to the money. So they're able to manipulate politicians and get things passed. It's not like they just come in and control everything. It's manipulation. And it's the same way it goes on today. You have people with access to the money printer. At that time, they were the one who issued currencies. So they infiltrate politicians with, side payments, bribes, whatever it was. and they get those politicians to pass. So Jefferson was vehemently against central banking in the United States. One got through, he fought, and many others fought to once the banking charter was up, they got rid of it. That's one central bank. Then the next one came a few years later, and it was Andrew Jackson who fought very hard. He actually got there was an assassination attempt on him, and the story goes it was actually the Rothschilds who allegedly hired someone to assassinate him, because of course the guy he had two guns. He tried to shoot Andrew Jackson. Both guns misfired, which is, I don't know, divine intervention, I guess, but both guns misfired. He was tried and they found him insane. Again, they manipulate everything, right? He was found insane, but then I think allegedly he was bragging that he was hired from powerful people in Europe to do that, because Andrew Jackson was very adamant about keeping another central bank out. So the second central bank that they were able to get it in, but he was able to, eradicate the charter. So that's two central banks. Fast forward, you have the wildcat banking era, which is basically, private banks who allegedly have gold, but then they started, doing fractional reserve. It's human nature. They started going after profits, lending more currency than they had gold. And, we get to the point where from the 1800s.
Yeah, but back then, okay, well, I have a question.
Yeah.
You can't type things into a computer. So how did that materialize, for lack of a better word? Like if you're lending what you don't even have and getting the interest for it, how back then were you able to do that?
So so they did use paper notes, like back then.
Okay. Wow.
So the thing was this, what it was is they were technically on gold standards, but the thing is you couldn't verify if they actually had the gold that was backing the currency. That's the thing. It's like the biggest problem with gold is its tangibility, because you have to prove that someone has it or has the amount they say they have to issue currency. So these central banks, to an extent, were semi-gold silver standards, like variations. So these central banks, they would allege that they, had the reserves backing it, but no one really knew, right? They made it to control. They issued the money they wanted to control. So fast forward, now we get to the point where we have the wildcat banks. A lot of them go under because they're doing fractional reserve. Like they're seeking profits, which is fine, I guess. But the problem is, if you don't have the reserves to back the currency you're lending out, and everyone comes running to get their money, it's a problem. This is exactly what happened. At the time, it was J.P. Morgan started a rumor that a lot of these banks were insolvent. It was just a rumor. No one even knew if it was true, but because there was fractional reserve banking, it caused a massive run on these banks. Banks collapsed, caused a giant panic, which spread, through the country. And that was the first reason they wanted to implement the third central bank, which is the Federal Reserve. That was 1907.
They put your competitors out of business.
Exactly. So people know J.P. Morgan. People think he was like this large magnate. He was owned and controlled by the Rothschilds. Like again, this isn't conspiracy stuff. This is like textbook history stuff. People hear Rothschilds like, oh, it's a conspiracy. Like, no, this is all. This stuff is actually documented. It's in history books. Like the Rothschilds are real. They are a banking dynasty. So they control J.P. Morgan. They control Rockefeller. The point is they caused a run on the bank. People lost confidence in these private banks. They said, oh, we need a lender of last resort. But people still had that semblance of in their spirit, like central banks are not good. So Edward G. Griffin wrote a great book called Creature of Jekyll Island. Because again, it's always been these manipulators trying to infiltrate countries. They had Europe, they had most of the world. They needed America. So they got very creative, and a lot of these banking families, they got together and they devised a way that they were going to sneak in the third central bank, which we have today, the Federal Reserve. They met on a secret island, Jekyll Island. They used like aliases so people wouldn't recognize them. They were basically putting out in to their puppets in Congress, and to before they manipulated people, again, perception, deception. They manipulated people thinking that implementing the Federal Reserve would be good for the banks, and people were very anti-bank back then. So they kind of inverted it, where they're like, no. If we don't pass this, it's it's good for the banks, or they just inverted it. Which what they really wanted was to implement the bank, that they used jargon and confused people, right? But even then, they were still getting resistance. So eventually, they get together on Jekyll Island, they conjure up a plan, and very strategically, they make sure the bill is going through Congress on Christmas Eve. So at that time, a lot of the Congress.
Didn't they take out some of their opponents too, though, to this? People who oppose this?
Yeah, there was yeah. I mean, there's allegedly some of them were on the Titanic. I don't know how true that is, like that, because there were a lot of guys who opposed the Federal Reserve on the Titanic, and they all mysteriously died. That's another rabbit hole I never really dug into. Like, some people allege that the Rothschilds sunk the Titanic. With everything that I know, I don't dismiss anything, because when you understand what really controls these people, like there is no doubt in my mind that something like that could be done and would be done. So it's possible. It's out there. I don't know if it's true. Never really looked into that. But ultimately, they get the Federal Reserve Act passed through Congress Christmas Eve. People are asleep or with their families, whatever. And now the United States has its third, and to this day, central bank. What people need to understand is that the Federal Reserve is not part of the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. It's a cartel. It's a private corporation. It's made up of a cartel of banks that are beholden to shareholders, secret shareholders. We know, you and me know who these shareholders are, but those are the manipulators. Those are the ones who are controlling everything. Once the Federal Reserve Bank, that was 1913, was implemented into our, I guess, monetary policy, America would never be the same. America was basically sold in 1913. It was hijacked.
Can I ask you one other thing? Sorry, just because I don't know the answer, but I'm wondering if this correlates. When did the dollar, at that time, did the dollar become the global currency?
At this time, England was still,
okay.
The world was still on a pound standard.
Okay.
There's been world reserve currency standards throughout the time, but at this time it was still Great Britain was still pretty much the top dog at that time. So Federal Reserve comes in 1913. Ironically, a year later, we have World War I. Again, now that the central bank had took a strong hold of the United States, it's just ironic. Within a year, 1914, World War I breaks out in Europe, because the same people manipulating the implementation of a central bank here in the United States are the same ones controlling the central banks in Europe. So you have World War I breakout. That causes a lot of havoc. Obviously, the United States actually really wasn't involved in World War I until like the very end, but that would now plant the seeds for the booming, the Roaring 20s, and this is what we talked about in the beginning, where banks, when they want to create a boom, they flood the system with credit. So World War I ends in 1914 to 1918. It's over. Now you have the 1920s about to start. They need to create a boom. They flood the money with they flood the system with credit again. So human nature, businesses, people start taking on debt, misallocating capital, malinvestment, waste. Because again, when you have easy money, if you have to go out and do something really hard for money, you're going to be more careful with it. But these people know that. They understand human psychology. They understand how the human psyche works. You want to create a bubble, you flood the system with credit. That lasts a decade. Credit boom, Roaring 20s. You learn it in high school, like the flappers, and you see like the old movies, gangsters and everything. Like, it was a booming time. Then you get to 1929. That's now the opportune time where the manipulators say, party's over. We control the boom, and now we're going to control the bust. How do they do it? Now they start pulling credit out of the system. How do they do that? They do that by not making loans and then starting to jack up interest rates. When interest rates go up, the debt you, because a lot of these loans
These were
are
adjustable, then I guess.
exactly the variable interest rate loans, because they know that's the key. They know, oh, your interest rates are low here, but when we're ready to, take credit out of the system and jack up interest rates, your debt now becomes unserviceable because you're getting bad market signals. Let's say you hired more employees, business was booming, roaring 20s, hired a ton of employees, inventory, people are buying, you're loading up, you're borrowing because everything is great. But remember what we talked about in the beginning, when they flood the system with credit plus interest. Credit is created, interest is not. All these indebted businesses have to pay back the principal plus the interest. Now everyone's scrambling to pay back, the interest that never existed in the first place.
So this is asset grabbing too, once they default.
That's the key. 1929 hits, Great Depression. They pull credit out, mess with the rates. It sends America, the world, into the global depression, all manipulated by central banks who control the currency. And what do? When I say opportune time, that's peak euphoria. And they're saying once they pull the credit out, jack up interest rates, all the things that are actually valuable, houses, cars, businesses, farmland, that's when they swoop in and grab it all. And it's not necessarily, like in some cases it's the banks, in some cases it's the corporations that are closest to the banks, who are both manipulated by the same hand. So it's like the people closest to the money printer, currency creation, those are the ones who go out and swoop everything up for the benefit of the cult. We're going to call them the cult, the manipulators of the world. It's a cult. Okay. That was the Great Depression. Now that would have major implications for US history to today. That Great Depression scarred a lot of people. That's what started sowing the seeds for entitlements. FDR, 1935, I think that's when Social Security came in. So like that mentality, because again, people don't know, and people like, listen, I want to live my life. I want to work a job. I just want to raise a family. Like, I don't care. People want to normal life. But when there's someone else manipulating everything, all of a sudden you think that you're doing something wrong, and now you're looking towards the government to take care of you. And that Great Depression, because this thing, average working people had nothing to do with depression. There's like this misconception, like, oh, greediness caused the depression. Who all of a sudden wakes up one day and says, you know what, I don't want to go to work today. I don't want to eat today. Like it's a misconception. That's what you're taught. Oh, human greed causes like people don't just wake up and say, oh, I decide I want to fire my employees today, and I want to lose that's a myth. Credit creation, credit contraction, interest rate manipulation, that is what controls every facet of a global monetary system. So that's a depression. People were.
But I guess to get around that, because I have a mortgage and I have a fixed rate mortgage. But I guess if you also want to seize assets, you just kill jobs.
Well, that's
industry.
So like obviously, like mortgages are fixed, so that you're not going to lose. It's not going to affect you if interest rates move. But if you're a business owner and you own a house, or an employee, that credit contraction. Let's say you work for a corporation. All these corporations are in massive debt. This entire planet is debt.
Yeah.
So if you work for a corporation, you have a mortgage. Your mortgage is fixed. Great. Interest rate's not going to affect whether your house, but what's going to affect your ability to service the mortgage on your house is if that corporation can continue to employ you. So like people don't lose homes because interest rates move. They lose homes when their jobs. I mean, you're probably hearing about it now. The tech layoffs. Like we had this giant boom. Now tech is just slashing. So all these people, let's say they bought a house, whatever, a couple of years ago, and they got it fixed. Great. But all of a sudden, if you get cut loose, how are you going to service the debt? And the currency,
especially when you paid for, because speaking on the housing boom during COVID is just ridiculous. The inventory wasn't there, and people were getting hundreds of thousands more than what their homes were worth. And people were just going for it because of the interest rates were
Yeah.
so low.
You know, and I'm gonna get to real
It's
estate. 'cause
quite ingenious, actually, what they're doing, because like, if they don't get you one way, they'll get you another way. It's like that Pat Benatar song. I used to like that when I was a kid.
To go back to
One way or another.
yeah, it's true, but like that, and like I don't want to be all over the place, but just to the beginning of the interview, I was you know, as I started to learn this stuff, I came to the hard realization that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many, if I took on multiple jobs, they're destroying the value of the currency. I can do everything right. You can go to, and that's another, I guess, coding encoded into this matrix is student debt. You have an entire generation of people, $1.6 trillion in debt that you can't, you know, claim bankruptcy. It's everything is designed to enslave you. When I started to come to this realization that, oh, go to school, work hard, you know, get a degree, and you'll find a, you know, a little safe, secure job, stock some money away in a 401k, and you're gonna sell off in the sunset. It's total nonsense. That, like, when these realizations started to come to me, and that's the bulk of the financial industry today is, you know, just put some money aside. The market always goes up, and you're going to be fine. Total nonsense. And when I started to realize this stuff, that's why I had to leave the financial industry. But I knew I still needed, you know, I obviously needed a job to pay the bills. So for the time being, you know, I work just to pay the bills. But I know there's a much bigger mission, because humanity needs to understand this stuff, because everyone is getting squeezed. It doesn't matter if you're wealthy, middle, like they're crushed. They're coming after the middle class. The rich are going to be all right because they're so far past the, I guess, the currency devaluation that they're gonna hold on. They're gonna be fine.
Yeah, but are you saying including the rich who are not part of this cult, or?
Yeah. So let me get to all that, because I guess this all ties together. I was at yeah, so like once I came to this realization, it's like I had to stop and really just start focusing on solutions to this problem. And the problem is they control the money. The cult, global cult, they control the monetaries. They control every government on the planet, with the exception of few, which always seem to be the ones that are demonized in the pathetic mainstream media. But the key is they control the global financial system. So once I knew, like, no matter what I do in life, and not to, I guess, like the normal stuff you're told, you're going up against a tidal wave. And I'll get into why the last 40 to 50 years of, you know, America, like, I guess our lifetime is going to be nothing, in my opinion, like what's coming, unless we figure this out, unless we solve the problem of you know, the central banks having control over the monetary system. So where I was at, Great Depression. Okay. 1939, the world is, you know, devastated by the Great Depression. People are scarred, massive pain, seeds for entitlements, causes the rise, socialism, fascism, communism in various parts of Europe. I think you know what comes next. World War II. I remember Federal Reserve, 1913, 1914, World War I. Correlation. Boom, 1920s, bust, 1929. Now we're in the 1930s. The world's, you know, in shambles. Great Depression, 1933, 1934, 1935, Social Security. It's not a good time. In comes the rise of dictators across Europe. That's, you know, Germany, Italy, Mussolini. You know, I don't, you know what comes next, because the seeds were sown. When they create that kind of devastation, people look toward anybody that's going to give them some semblance of hope. So you get these psychopaths that rise up and they start blaming people. Exactly. They start blaming this group, that group. They're going to have all the solutions. And because the engineered collapse brings people down that frequency of emotional fear, stress, depression, you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable to these, you know, dark entities that rise up in the form of all these dictators that World War II. That sparks World War II. And this is how, one thing I will say is that this cult that controls the planet, they create superpowers. So before this, they used to say England was the empire where the sun never set. I'm sure you've heard that before.
Yeah.
They create empires to do their, their dirty work around the planet. So World War II goes, and now America's, and this is, and I got to say this first because you have to understand what it really means to be a patriot. I think a lot of people conflate patriotism with licking the boot of whoever's in the White House, or going along with whatever narrative the White House puts out. It's like, oh, you're not patriotic because you're XYZ, right? People need to separate patriotism. Patriotism, this country was founded hard money standard with a constitution. It was founded it wasn't founded as a democracy.
Republic, yeah.
It was a constitutional republic, which may not, listen, it's not the best way, but it's far better than democracy, because democracy is mob rule. If you control the people, and if you use your propaganda to get them to believe what you want them to believe, of course, they're going to vote themselves in enslavement every time. And we see it everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy because if you choose all the people who ultimately choose which way to go in a democracy, then you always win.
Exactly.
That's that mob. I was just going off that mob rule, because that's what it is. It's just, okay, we're going to give you a choice, but we're going to pick your choices. And it's the same thing.
It's never.
So it's like, okay, you want this one or you want this one?
Yeah.
Same thing. And they're going to make all the decisions for you.
That's exactly how it works. Because it's never by force. It's almost like it's
an illusion of choice.
It's an illusion of choice. Like, you think you have choice, but they manipulate you into choosing the choice they want you to choose. Enslavement. So back to, okay, World War II. Let's just say the cult now has its eyes. The central bankers know the United States is the perfect next superpower for the next phase of their plan. The United States is surrounded by two giant oceans, Atlantic, Pacific Oceans, generally pretty far away from Europe, which is right. You have every country on top of each other. So long story short, World War II is playing out. America still had, we went through the Industrial Revolution. We had a strong manufacturing-based factories. We were able to produce. That we were still a producer nation back then. Europe's in ashes, blowing, the war's raging in Europe, and Europe's in ashes. Strategically, the people manipulating, our government they understood, it's like, we are going to make all the materials for this war, because Europe's bombing each other. They're bombing each other's factories. They needed to get the materials to fight the war from somewhere. That's where the United States, the vast majority, which with the exception of Pearl Harbor, the United States was untouched. We had all, and this is where the conspiracy stuff comes in, because on one end, there's the truth that America was fighting to stop the spread of fascism, communism, the Nazis. But in reality, this is the thing that people don't know. Both sides of this war was funded by the same hand. Mm-hmm. It's not saying that the people that were fighting, the soldiers who went and sacrificed their lives, they were fighting for the right thing. When you see how high it goes up, then you start to learn the dark truth. American subsidiary companies, Ford, a lot of them, and this is detailed in David's books, were funding secret through they had all these subsidiaries. They were funding the Nazi Party. So we had our soldiers sacrificing their lives, dying horrific battles, while at the same time we had our own. Again, you had to separate patriotism from cult manipulation within our country. They were funding the enemy. And they ultimately decide who wins and who loses, because they control the money. They control the energy. Europe's in ashes. We're creating all the material, sending it, to our allies. But at the same time, we have companies, funding and sending materials to the enemy. Regardless, now you have, we're getting paid in gold, right? So Europe is paid, all their gold reserves are flooding over to the United States to pay for all this war material. So when the war finally ends, 1944 is a key date that people need to understand. That's what would be the first global reset. They're talking about the Great Reset now. Well, this was the first one. 1944 was Bretton Woods. The war was ending. It was pretty much, everyone knew that the Allies were going to win. And the major, the major governments or economies of the world gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and basically decided United States is unscathed. They're in one piece, strong manufacturing base, has now all the gold because Europe paid for all their war materials, everything that they needed to fight the war. They were paying us in gold. So now the United States has almost all, they have a good amount, vast majority of the world's gold, which meant our dollar it was the only thing that made sense to peg for a global reserve standard, because everything else was in shambles from the war. So that's when at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 1944, everyone got together and decided, you know what, the US is in one piece, has all the gold, strong manufacturing, they have all the gold, so we're going to peg all our currencies to the dollar. And the dollar would now be pegged to gold. So you have gold pegged to the dollar, pegged to every currency, all the major currencies in the world. This was the implementation of the cult creating their next superpower. Because when you create a superpower, you create it to carry out your nefarious things throughout the globe. And I got to keep revisiting this, separate patriotism from cult-controlled manipulation. This is not saying, America has a lot of great things. Our spirit is derived from freedom, from not wanting to be told what to do. But once they got a central bank, they control our currency. They now can dictate the thing, America's, foreign policies, right? So 1944, you have the United States is now the new superpower. Basically, that's the Great Reset. It was England. England was the empire. They did all their heinous acts around the world. The manipulators now decided America's the perfect superpower. Surrounded by ocean, was strong manufacturing, built up a strong military. And I want to say one thing about Pearl Harbor that I didn't get to is FDR was elected, promising that he would not get the United States involved in the European war. But the cult knows they needed America to get involved. And again, these are the people who manipulate the politicians. Who passes certain policies? FDR, adamant, we will not get involved in their war. We will not get involved in their war. What happens? All of a sudden, policies start trickling. Now they start embargoing Japan, cutting Japan's raging war in the Pacific. We're not involved. But now we're cutting off their oil, sanctions. Sound familiar today? Sanctions, Russia, Ukraine, sanctions. Eventually we cut them off from oil. They're fighting a war that they know it's not that they manipulate us. They manipulate policy that they know it's like push to get an outcome. And the outcome was Japan got to the point we have to attack. And that's how they do it. It's not to say they knew, they obviously had sides, but
it's like provocation.
But it's the same concept as today with NATO and Ukraine and Russia, which we can get into, but it's very similar. It's the policy you have to look at that it's working toward deriving an outcome. The outcome was getting the United States in the war. We did not care about all the things, contrary to popular belief, we weren't we're over here surrounded by and again, there's no social media back then. You hear the newspaper, we didn't really care what was going on in Europe. That was all manufactured from, what we talked about before. So now the United States was dragged into the war. We sent our troops, we were paid in gold, we manufactured everything to fight World War II. World War II ends. United States is now the global reserve currency of the world. We're in one piece. We have all the gold. We're now the champion. We're, everyone's currency is pegged to ours. That's 19. So now between 1944 and 1945, up into the 1960s, we get a chip on our shoulder. We start deficit spending again, because the problem with government is we're led to believe that they're there to serve the people, but ultimately it's just not true. So governments end up, government politicians don't create value. They're not producers. Like, they don't build businesses. They don't do anything productive. They're parasites.
They're parasites.
So
They
from
live off the
19
money
so
of
we at the end
people
of,
who do something.
exactly. So now we're at the end of World War II. Up, for simplicity, from 1945 to the 1960s, we're spending like maniacs because we have the gold standard. This comes back to gold. How does Europe know how much gold we have in our vaults? I mean, we have all the gold. We have most of the world's gold, and it's known, right? But at the same time, now we're doing all this deficit spending. So you have the Korean War of the 1950s, you have Vietnam in the 60s, early 70s, and people start to think, like, where's all this money? We get you have all the gold, but how are you guys spending all this money? Oh, and then you have Lyndon B. Johnson, who was the president at the time during the 60s. I don't know if you remember back in school, Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, entitlements. That's entitlement.
Yeah.
That's where it all starts coming together. It's like, because politicians live to make all these promises, they face no consequences for their spending. It's like anyone can get to power and just spend like a maniac. It's like, if you have a business and you're spending, your business fails, you fail. But what happens to a politician if he spends, or he or she spends, and then they create a disaster? Oh, well, they just leave office. Like, their term is up and they're out. Or even worse, you have these career politicians who just stay there and create bad policy after bad policy after bad policy.
Yeah, but the people suffer. That's the
well,
thing.
that's my point. They
don't
pay
suffer.
no price for being wrong. Politicians pay no price for being wrong. So now we're deficit spending like maniacs, funding, again, all these wars are ultimately engineered. Like Vietnam was over oil, and then you dig deep, you find out that they're ultimately engineered by the cult for cult purposes.
I did hear drugs too, I think, was actually a part of that.
Yeah, opium. There was a big, there's a good movie on that. Denzel Washington, I forget, the American Gangster talks about that. I think that was, they're importing like heroin from, again, that's all shadow banking business, like that exists too. But the key here is that our government, we're now the top dog. We're funding Korean War, Vietnam, spending on entitlements. Oh, because that's what they need to promise all these things. So how do you have to pay for it? So we're essentially printing more dollars than we have gold. 1965 hits, President John de Gaulle of France calls BS. This is bullshit. You guys, there's no way the dollars that you're funding all these wars and entitlements backed by the amount of gold you have. This is total nonsense. We want our gold back. France sends a navy, and again, this is, at this time, gold is convertible to dollars. So the rest of the world has their currencies pegged to dollars, and now but you're still allowed to exchange your currency for gold because it's still technically we're on a gold standard. But we're creating a ton more money than we have gold. France sends back, then it starts to trickle around. Whoa, something's up here. These guys, there's no, France is on to something. You know what? We want our gold back. More countries. Essentially, John de Gaulle caused a run on the bank, which is the United States. Everyone starts sending their currency, or they take their currencies, convert to dollars for gold. So all this currency starts flooding America, and we're sending gold. This is conspiracy because we don't know if it's true. There's Fort Knox, which is supposedly where they hold all these gold bars. It hasn't been audited allegedly since 1974, and you have people who say it has been audited. It's audited every year. The gold is there. I don't know. I have no idea. This bank run that the president of France caused in 1965. It could have. We might not have a lot of gold. Like we may have no gold. Who knows? There's people that say we have none. Some say we have some say we have it all. No one knows. And that's the problem with gold is no one, you're trusting someone to tell you what we have. Oh, no, we have it. Well, let me see your vaults. Oh, no, I can't see the vaults. So it causes a bank run. Everyone starts taking their gold. Now we have an emergency because the bank run's not stopping. They see all these wars we're doing. They see this. They're like, so everyone is just calling in their gold, sending. So this is creating a problem because now we have all this currency flooding the system. Now take that to so that was 65. Take it to 1971, the infamous 1971, August 15th. Richard Nixon takes the U.S. dollar off the gold standard. He closes the gold window, closes convertibility to gold. This destroys the value of the dollar at the time. Like, it causes absolute havoc, causes just pandemonium across the world. Now we have a problem because we're technically still the world reserve currency, but there's nothing hard backing our money. That's when, I don't know, do you know who Henry Kissinger is?
Oh, yeah.
Absolute reptile creature evil. I'm sure your audience knows. Henry Kissinger, called Puppet, was Nixon's handler. You had Henry Kissinger and people like Paul Volcker, who was head of the Federal Reserve chairman at the time, all in Nixon's ear to take the dollar off the gold standard. Because he knew this has serious implications. Like, we are the superpower. We take the only thing that gives a dollar value. If we sever that, this is pandemonium. Like, we don't know they make him do it. He gets on August 15th, 1971, temporarily. The famous speech online, we're temporarily, closing the window to dollar gold convertibility to protect the value of the dollar and crush the speculators. Nonsense.
That's quite the opposite.
Nothing from government is ever temporary, right? Because here we are today, still off a gold standard. Now we needed something. Okay, how do we give value back? Like, we're gonna lose dominance or whatever. Enter the petrodollar. Henry Kissinger, again, all these creatures in the shadows behind Nixon, said, you need to tie that dollar to oil. So they derive a plan to make a deal with Saudi Arabia to back, they essentially offer Saudi Arabia protection, military protection, because again, we have an insanely strong military, offer military protection if they only sell their oil in dollars. At the time, they're one of the big, if not the biggest oil exporter in the world. Everyone now that needs to import oil from Saudi Arabia, they wouldn't take these nations' currencies. They only took dollars. Everyone else now needed to go out into the market and buy dollars to buy oil. That's what now backed the dollar. So that was the birth of the petrodollar. But before even that happened, they actually needed to create some havoc for what comes next in the 80s. So let's say at that time, the cartel of companies in the United States, the oil cartel, the Rockefeller, Exxon, all these BP in England, all these companies were secretly colluded. Domestically, the United States oil companies, the biggest companies, were slashing domestic supply. And again, this was Nixon and his advisors deciding, for whatever reason, that they dramatically slashed the United States domestic supply of oil. So now we're at dangerously low levels of oil. And then at the same time, you have a Bilderberg meeting in Sweden, secret Bilderberg meeting in Sweden, where they're going to, all the OPEC companies are deciding we're going to raise oil prices by 400%. So you have domestic supply in the United States low, super insanely low, and a collusion to raise oil prices 400%. And in comes, and again, all this is manipulated because you have to be blind not to be able to connect the dots when I put this together. No oil at home, jack up the price 400% of oil. Now you instigate a war in the Middle East. Now you have what's called the Yom Kippur Wars in the 72 and 1973. Egypt and Syria unsuccessfully tried to invade Israel. Again, now here comes back to the policy. Remember, everything is policy. The United States, the advisors, decides to back Israel, just slap in the face to Saudi Arabia. So after we're making these deals with them, Saudi Arabia now embargoes the United States from oil. And this causes absolute havoc because now we cut it. Why would we cut our domestic supplies, to alarming levels, and then mysteriously a war pops up a few years later? Henry Kissinger was going out and misrepresenting both sides of these wars. He was talking to Israel and he was talking to the Arabs. He was talking to Syria and Egyptians, misrepresenting each other's side to fuel gasoline on the war. Again, this isn't conspiracy. This is all well documented in many books. And that's adding fuel to the fire. We're now embargoed from oil. So we don't have oil at home and there's an oil embargo. The oil price shock, oil skyrockets. This sends, now remember, by engineer, sends the world into another recession. Most people, unless you'd have to be probably in your, I guess, 60s, maybe to remember the stagflationary 70s, which was long gas lines. Like most people, they weren't, unless you were like an adult in the 70s, you won't remember this stuff. But that's what's known as the stagflationary 70s. High inflation, oil prices there was long lines, like there was no fuel anywhere. The rest of the third world got absolutely crushed. And this was the reason this happened. That was they created the US superpower. Now they needed to capture the third world. And this is how they did it. They engineered the oil shock. Oil is energy. It's the lifeblood of the planet, essentially, because everything is derived from oil. Transportation, business, everything, oil affects everything. Third world is in shambles, starvation, death, insane poverty, all these third world, Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, these governments are desperate. That's the opportune time where they're going to start the next influx of credit. They create the problem. They decimate everyone's lifestyle. They cause recession, depression. So now we have the dollar standard. The war ends relatively quick. It's not a long war, but the war ends. The world's in shambles. So now this is leading into the early mid 70s to late 70s, and the world it's a deep recession, and they got to find ways to how do we pull out of this? So the next thing that happens is enter Paul Volcker. Inflation's running rampant in the United States. Gas is insane. So there's all this inflation, and they start to bring in a term called monetarism, which means basically jacking up interest rates to insane heights to kill inflation. So, and we're getting closer to where we are today. So now figure this is now the late 70s, early 80s. We get to the point where the world is it's such a bad recession, and there's so much. It's stagflation is high inflation with asset prices collapsing. So like your hard assets, things are down, but prices are still up because of the oil supply chain shocks. It's the worst economic landscape there can be. And that's what a lot of people today are saying. We're entering stagflation, where you have high inflation, low asset price. They needed a way to get out of that. They knew exactly what. So enter. That's now you have Volcker, you have Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and they're talking about jacking up interest rates. So long story short, interest rates skyrocket 20%. All this. Actually, let me backtrack because this is very important. While the world was in a deep recession, all these third world countries were desperate. That's when all these our shadow, I guess, or the shadow government starts sending out what's called economic hitmen. John Perkins wrote a book called.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
I'm sorry. This was a big part. I'm not reading these. I just memorize it, but sorry to the audience. That was a big part I missed. John Perkins wrote a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. So when I said they create the massive recession, all these third world countries are desperate. That's when they send their economic hitmen. Of course, they're not called economic hitmen. They're named, chief economic advisor, suits, briefcase. They go to all these countries. They basically target a country with really good natural resources. And they, again, remember, they control the central banks who control the middlemen, control the economic hitmen. They have fake money, digits on a screen that don't exist. They can lend as much as they want. So these countries are desperate, riots, people starving. They look for these vulnerable governments, say, oh, we'll lend you X, Y, Z. They look for illiterate, not illiterate in the sense, but like economically illiterate politicians. They look for vulnerable people to talk all this jargon of like, oh, it's going to fix this and fix that. So what ends up happening is they seduce these governments into taking their loans. Then they send in their cult-controlled multinationals to suck up the resources, knowing full well, and remember, these loans are variable rate. That's key for what I'm going to go back to. Variable interest rate loans that they know that these people are not going to be able to pay back. They send in their multinational corporations to extract all the, to basically start extracting natural resources for the West. And what happens? Eventually the time comes where they can't pay the loans. Like it gets so bad, and that's that opportune time where the cult comes in. Boom, interest rates up. Variable rate, you're struggling to service your debt. All of a sudden, interest rates skyrocket to 20%, which was insane at the time. Wiped out. You're the third, and there's this and this is again, separate patriotism from cult-controlled, monopoly. We crushed, not we, me and you, American citizens didn't do any of this. Our pathetic politicians and their handlers crushed the third world. And it's not just us, the Western nations. Like there's always misconception, oh, the West are the good guys. Total effing nonsense. They're manipulated. They're the ones who essentially crushed the third world through their multinational corporations at the loans that the economic hitmen would knowingly offer these countries, knowing that they're not going to be paid back. And then you have, Volcker come in, who's paraded as this hero today in all the macro space. Oh, Volcker saved the U.S. from inflation. No, Volcker crushed the third world knowingly. Paul Volcker, Council of Foreign Relations, Bilderberg, Trilateral Committee. These,
It's always the usual suspects.
I mean, I know your audience knows.
You
these
start to
people.
look at their associations and
Yeah,
it's like, oh, what a coincidence.
Exactly. So like
So then they're taking as the collateral those natural resources. Is that what's going on?
And that's the key. All right. Well, listen, you can't pay back the money, but you got some oil there, and you have some nice land over there, and this and that, and well, let's come to a compromise. All right, you don't have to pay us back the fake money that we never had, that we typed, essentially created out of existence. You're not going to pay us back because, it's fine. But we now control all this. Oh, if a war happens to erupt, now you got to side with us. And the kicker was, some of these politicians, some of these leaders actually had a backbone, and they refused this. And
did you say, I was just thinking about that actually, and I'm not good with history. I don't really have a big interest in it. I probably should have more, but is that what Gaddafi did in Libya?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, Gaddafi wanted to take the Libyan dinar. He wanted to put it on a gold standard. And again, that's the cult that controls our government. Remember, if they want the dollar to be king, they do whatever it takes. And they use their reptiles in government like Hillary Clinton and all the others to carry out coups, fake revolutions to take these leaders down. I'm not saying these leaders are saints.
Yeah, no, I know.
But
But I thought he spoke out pretty vocally.
Oh, he was
like,
very,
and tried to uncover
he wanted to
these
unite
plans.
Africa under like a gold-backed currency and use he wanted to back the Libyan dinar with gold. And that was a no-no because the ones who control our government, we're still dollar standard. So anyone who goes against that, and it was the same with Saddam in Iraq. He wanted to start taking euros for his oil. The second you go against, again, when they control, when they have what they want to control, like they have, when they're, let's say they need the dollar to be strong and you go against the dollar, that's when you get invaded. That's when you get taken out. So back to the
Isn't that
economic.
like what Russia's doing right now? Because
Well, yeah,
they're
that's
saying
why
they
this
don't
all-
want to get
that-
paid for their
that's-
resources in
That's
dollars.
why all this ties together. The economic hitmen, the leaders that didn't go with they didn't play ball, ended up having a mysterious plane crash, an intervention to the back of the head by suicide. It always had that. Again, these, like, people don't want to believe that that's how that is how the world works.
But it's like, I guess people don't live long enough to see the patterns, maybe, and they
Yeah.
don't teach history the way they're supposed to. But I just can't understand why people can't see the patterns. Like, it's constant. It's that, David Icke problem, reaction, solution. It's nonstop. It just keeps going and going and going. It's the
Yeah.
same playbook over and over again.
Exactly. So it's, you get, so now we have the third world. We have them. That's it. This is the 1980s. Volcker sends rates 20%. It,
Mhm.
they take money out of, they interest rates up. They take, they cool down with the credit creation. Everything starts, inflation starts to come down. Things start to normalize. But we now own the third world. We own the third world. That's, when I say we, not me and you,
Mhm.
are traders, politicians, and people of influence. They took the third world. Now we're in the 1980s. You have Reagan, and this is what we are actually talking about this, I think, through chat, but the struggle of regulation. I am anti-regulation. I am anti-state intervention, but, and this is where I struggle, because now this is the 1980s. We own the third world, but Wall Street is an unknown, and like, people don't understand that Wall Street's equities, that wasn't what ran the world back then. Real production, building, farming, real tangible things are what gave the world. That's what the global economy was based on. Ronald Reagan, again, also had handlers. In the name of freedom, the freedom for Wall Street to do what they want, implements deregulation. And this is why it's conflicting to me, because on one end, I hate regulation. I want the state far away from the free market as possible. All they do is, stifle and hurt and create unnecessary hurdles for innovation. But this country, again, it's the best country on the planet, and it has so many incredible things. So some of the regulation made sense. You couldn't have all these, financial engineering and like, all of the financial system was it was boring. It was just basic bonds, small, it was very boring, right? Reagan he deregulates in the name of freedom. And what does that create? And again, when I'm saying these people do things, I'm not saying they consciously even know what they're doing, because they have handlers. They have advisors in one ear. Oh, you should do this.
Special interest groups that they need to cater to as well.
Exactly. The lobbyists, Wall Street becomes a big lobbyist. They take away they deregulate everything. What does that do? It creates the Wall Street casino. That creates derivatives. Futures and options contracts used to be based on agriculture. Like, it used to be based on, betting the price of like a bale of hay or whatever. That's what futures and options were meant for. Now, deregulation allows you to create all these synthetic financial instruments based on whatever it is you want to create, because there's no regulation. And again, I am anti-regulation, and I hate saying, because it makes me sound like a statist, but some regulation made sense, because the architects knew, or the cult knew, what they were doing when they started implementing that deregulation. They knew what was going to be created, because again, they have handlers everywhere. So what happens? Wall Street becomes the giant parasite, the financial arm of the cult that it is today. So we have, that's the 1980s. You start seeing the financial sector start to take more and more of a percentage of US GDP. Again, it was like 2% in the 70s. Like it was nothing. Like we think of financial system today and we think it's like, back then it was nothing. It was like 2% of GDP. People didn't really think about stocks. The dollar still had value back then. You could save money, buy a house cash, save up, buy a house cash. You could go to college with a summer job. You could do all these things with a strong currency. And that's what people think today, because that's all we know is, oh, you got to take out student loans. You have to get into a big mortgage. You have to no, back then the currency was strong. Back then you were at, there was obviously some debt, but you were, for the most part, the currency had value. So you were able to save. That's what it meant to work all summer and save up money and buy something. Once deregulation was pulled by Reagan, all that shenanigans, it just became an absolute monster. And that takes us to today.
Okay, hold on a second. We're going to break.
Yeah.
Because I think I'm going to break this up because it's a lot of material. So we're going to break.
I can do multiple, we can do